Brenda didn't realize that the crumpled juice box she kicked under the seat belonged to the only person on the plane who could erase her existence from the aviation industry with a single phone call. The silver-plated hull of the Boeing 777 shimmered under the harsh terminal lights of JFK, a titan of engineering preparing to leap across the Atlantic. Inside the pressurized sanctuary of the first-class cabin, the air smelled of expensive leather, sterilized jasmine, and the quiet, oppressive weight of old money. Brenda Vance adjusted her silk scarf for the 20th time, her reflection in the galley mirror revealing a woman whose professional mask was as rigid as the starch in her blouse. She had spent 15 years climbing the ranks of Skybound Airways, not through warmth or service, but through a calculated, icy efficiency that prioritized the right kind of passenger. To Brenda, the cabin was a chessboard, and she was the queen, protecting the elite from the clutter of the common. Her eyes darted toward 2A, where a boy no older than 10 sat alone. He was dressed in a faded navy hoodie and worn sneakers, a stark, jarring contrast to the bespoke suits and cashmere wraps surrounding him. To Brenda, he was a smudge on a masterpiece, a mistake of the booking system that she intended to correct with a series of small, sharp humiliations. She didn't see a child. She saw an interloper who didn't belong in the sanctuary of the wealthy. Leo sat quietly, his small hands resting on a heavy, leather-bound folder that looked far too large for him. His eyes, wise beyond his years and clouded with a recent, profound grief, watched the clouds through the window. He didn't notice the way Brenda's lip curled as she passed him, nor did he hear the sharp click of her heels that signaled her disapproval. He was thinking of his grandfather, Arthur Sterling, a man who had built an empire from nothing but a law degree and an iron will. Arthur had died 3 weeks ago, leaving Leo not just with a vast inheritance, but with the weight of the Sterling Legal Group, the firm that held the exclusive, ironclad contracts for every legal dispute, merger, and labor negotiation for Skybound Airways. Leo wasn't just a passenger. He was the primary beneficiary of the firm that effectively owned the airline's soul. But to the world, he was just a kid in a hoodie, traveling to London to meet the executors of a will he barely understood. The first confrontation occurred 20 minutes after takeoff. The fastened seatbelt sign chimed off, and the ritual of first-class service began. Brenda glided down the aisle with a tray of warm nuts and vintage champagne. She stopped at 1A, offering a beaming, practiced smile to a tech mogul. She moved to 1B, her voice a melodic purr as she greeted a fashion editor. Then, she reached 2A. Leo looked up, his voice small but polite. "Excuse me, ma'am, could I please have some apple juice?" Brenda didn't stop. She didn't even slow down. She walked past him as if he were made of glass, the scent of her perfume lingering like a slap. Leo blinked, confused. He waited a few minutes, thinking she might have missed him, then pressed the attendant call button. The chime echoed softly in the cabin. Brenda, standing at the galley, watched the light flash on her panel. She took a slow sip of water, adjusted her hair, and waited. She waited until the light had pulsed for a full 3 minutes before she finally moved, her face a mask of annoyed condescension. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice loud enough to make the elderly woman in 3A turn and stare. She didn't lean down to his level. She stood over him, using her height to intimidate. Leo looked up, his grip tightening on his folder. "I was just wondering if I could have some juice, please. And maybe a blanket? It's a bit cold." Brenda let out a short, sharp laugh that contained no mirth. "Listen, honey, we have a very limited supply of refreshments in first class. These are reserved for our premium guests. I'm sure you're very comfortable in that seat, which I'm still trying to figure out how you got, but I can't be wasting high-end inventory on children who probably belong in the back of the bus. If you're thirsty, there's a water fountain near the lavatories in economy. I suggest you use that." Leo's brow furrowed. "But my ticket says first class." "My grandfather." Brenda cut him off with a flick of her wrist. "I don't care who your grandfather is. He probably used his points to stick you up here so he wouldn't have to deal with you. Now, sit still, stay quiet, and don't touch the call button again unless it's a genuine emergency. We are here to serve adults who pay full fare, not babysit. She turned on her heel and marched away, leaving Leo in a stunned silence. The fashion editor in 1B looked over, a flicker of pity in her eyes, but she said nothing, unwilling to break the unspoken code of the cabin. Leo looked down at his folder. Inside was a document his grandfather had made him memorize, the Sterling Skybound Master Service Agreement. Clause 14.2 stated that the airline staff were required to maintain the highest standards of professional conduct and egalitarian service toward all passengers, regardless of age or status, failing which the legal firm reserved the right to trigger an immediate compliance audit of the entire cabin crew department. Leo wasn't a spiteful child, but he had been raised by a man who believed that power was a tool for justice, not a weapon for bullying. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, gold-encased fountain pen. He began to take notes on the back of his boarding pass. 14:22 Greenwich Mean Time. Attendant Vance. Refusal of basic beverage. Verbal disparagement of passenger status. Brenda, meanwhile, was in the galley, whispering to a junior attendant named Sarah. "Did you see that brat? Sitting there like he owns the place. I bet his parents are some middle management types who won't even notice if he's ignored. I'm not wasting the Krug or the beluga on a kid in a sweatshirt. If he wants food, I'll find an extra snack box from the back later." "Maybe." Sarah looked uneasy. "Brenda, the manifest says his seat was booked under the Sterling account. Isn't that the group that handles the corporate legal stuff?" Brenda scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "The Sterling account has thousands of employees. This is probably some clerk's kid. Besides, even if he were a somebody, look at him. He's a nobody until he puts on a suit. In this cabin, I decide who is a priority." Her arrogance was a fortress built on years of getting away with subtle cruelties. She had mastered the art of the invisible passenger, the person she decided didn't exist, usually someone she deemed beneath her social standing. Dinner service began an hour later. The cabin was filled with the aroma of seared sea bass and truffle risotto. Brenda moved with practiced grace, laying out linen cloths and silver cutlery. When she reached Leo, she didn't lay a cloth. She simply dropped a small, plastic-wrapped package of dry crackers and a lukewarm cup of tap water onto his tray table. "That's all we have left that's suitable for children," she lied, her eyes gleaming with a malicious challenge. Leo looked at the crackers, then at the succulent steak being served to the man next to him. "The menu said there was a salmon option," Leo said quietly. Brenda leaned in, her voice a harsh whisper. "The salmon is for people who contribute to the economy, not for children who take up space. Eat your crackers and shut up, or I'll have the captain radio ahead that we have a disruptive minor on board. Do you want to be met by the police in London?" Leo felt a lump in his throat, but he didn't cry. His grandfather had told him, "The loudest person in the room is the weakest. The one who watches, listens, and records is the one who wins." Leo nodded slowly. "I understand, Miss Vance. You're making your priorities very clear." Brenda smirked, thinking she had broken his spirit. "Good. I'm glad we have an understanding." She walked away, unaware that Leo had just clicked a small digital recorder inside his folder. He had captured every word of the threat. He spent the next 3 hours watching her. He watched her dote on the wealthy, watched her ignore a woman in premium economy who came forward to ask for an aspirin, and watched her mock the junior staff. Every instance went into his notes. He was building a case, not just for himself, but for every person Brenda had ever looked down upon. As the flight crossed the midpoint of the Atlantic, the cabin lights dimmed for sleep. Leo remained awake, the blue light of the seatback screen illuminating his determined face. He opened his folder to a section marked Personnel Directives. He found the bypass code for the airline's internal crew feedback portal, a high-level access key reserved for the legal department's oversight. He plugged his tablet into the seat's USB port and entered the code. The screen blinked, and suddenly, he had access to Brenda Vance's entire employment file. He saw the complaints, dozens of them over the years, all dismissed by a mid-level manager who was a personal friend of hers. He saw her glowing self-evaluations and her history of managing difficult passengers. Leo's fingers flew across the keyboard. He wasn't just filing a complaint. He was initiating a formal extraordinary review under the Sterling Mandate. This was a nuclear option in the airline's bylaws, usually reserved for safety violations or massive financial fraud. It required the captain and the lead purser to be notified immediately of a legal breach occurring on the aircraft. Brenda was in the galley, resting her feet and reading a tabloid, when the lead purser, a stern man named Marcus, walked in holding a printed manifest and a tablet. His face was pale. "Brenda, we have a Tier 1 legal alert coming from the cabin. Did you have a confrontation with 2A?" Brenda laughed, not looking up from her magazine. "The kid? Yeah, he was being demanding. I put him in his place." "Why? Did he cry to his mommy on the Wi-Fi?" Marcus didn't laugh. He stepped closer, his voice trembling. "Brenda, look at the tablet." The alert didn't come from passenger. It came from the legal department executive override. The system identifies the passenger in 2A as Leo Sterling. "Does that name mean anything to you?" Brenda's smile faltered. "Sterling? Like the law firm?" Marcus nodded. "Like the man who owns the firm that owns our contracts. The man who died recently. This is his grandson and sole heir. And he just filed a 14-page incident report with attached audio recordings of you threatening him with police intervention for asking for apple juice." The color drained from Brenda's face, leaving her looking gray and haggard under the fluorescent lights. He's just a kid," she whispered, the magazine slipping from her numb fingers. "He can't do that." Marcus looked at her with a mixture of pity and disgust. "He didn't just do it. He triggered an immediate on-board deposition. The captain is legally obligated to witness his statement before we land. If we don't comply, the airline loses its indemnity insurance for this entire flight. You're not just in trouble, Brenda. You've just cost yourself your career and possibly the airline millions in a breach of contract suit." Brenda felt the cabin tilt, though the plane was perfectly level. Then nobody in the hoodie had just pulled the rug out from under her entire world. She tried to stand, her legs feeling like jelly. I can fix it. I'll go apologize. I'll give him anything he wants. I'll give him the whole galley." Marcus shook his head. "It's too late. The report is already at corporate HQ in London and New York. They've already responded. They want you removed from service immediately. You are to spend the rest of the flight in a jump seat in the rear. You're not to interact with any passengers. And Brenda? The legal team is waiting at the gate. Not for him. For you." Brenda's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked down the long, dark aisle towards seat 2A. The boy was still there, a small silhouette against the window. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't cheering. He was just sitting there, waiting for the justice he knew was coming. The transition was swift and brutal. Marcus walked to 2A, bowing slightly as he approached Leo. The other passengers watched in confusion as the lead purser whispered to the boy in the hoodie with the kind of deference usually reserved for royalty. Marcus then turned to Brenda, who was standing paralyzed in the aisle. "Hand me your cabin key and your ID badge, Brenda. Now." The click of the badge being unclipped sounded like a guillotine blade to Brenda. She handed it over, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. She was led past the passenger she had spent the night impressing, past the tech mogul and the fashion editor, her face burning with a shame so deep it felt physical. As she passed Leo, she paused, her voice a broken rasp. "Please, I didn't know." Leo looked up from his folder. His eyes weren't angry. They were cold, reflecting the same steel his grandfather had used to win 1,000 court cases. "That's the problem, Miss Vance," Leo said, his voice steady and clear. "You only treat people with respect when you think they have the power to hurt you. My grandfather taught me that you should treat everyone as if they have that power, because one day you'll be right. You weren't refusing service to a child. You were refusing service to a human being. And in my firm, we don't allow our clients to be represented by people who don't understand that distinction." Brenda had no response. There was no defense for the truth. She was led away to the back of the plane, relegated to the very economy-class souls she had spent her life deriding. The rest of the flight was a surreal blur for the crew. The captain himself came back to apologize to Leo, offering him the jump seat in the cockpit for the landing, but Leo politely declined. He stayed in 2A, finishing his notes and preparing the summary for the London legal team. He felt a strange sense of peace. He had been terrified of traveling alone, terrified of the world without his grandfather's protection. But he realized now that his grandfather hadn't left him alone. He had left him with the tools to protect himself and others. The leather-bound folder wasn't just a collection of papers, it was a shield. And as the lights of London began to twinkle through the morning mist, Leo knew that the descent of the plane was only the beginning of Brenda Vance's long fall. The wheels hit the tarmac with a soft thud, the spoilers deploying with a roar of hydraulic power. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Brenda sat in the back, her head in her hands. She could see the flashing lights of the airport police and the dark sedans of the corporate executives waiting on the apron. She had always loved the arrival, the moment of triumph when she stepped off the plane, the queen of the skies. Now, she was a prisoner of her own arrogance, waiting to be escorted off her own stage. She had underestimated the kid in the hoodie, and in doing so, she had forgotten the most basic rule of her profession. Every passenger has a story, and some stories have the power to change your life forever. The door of the aircraft hissed open, the humid London air rushing in. Leo stood up, straightened his hoodie, and tucked his folder under his arm. He walked toward the exit, where Marcus and the captain stood at attention. "Thank you for the flight," Leo said, nodding to them both. "I'll make sure the report reflects your cooperation in the latter half of the journey." The captain wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling. We truly regret the oversight." Lau stepped onto the jet bridge, where a man in a sharp black suit was waiting. "Mr. Sterling? I'm Mr. Henderson from the London office. We have the termination papers and the suit for breach of contract ready for your signature." Leo looked back at the plane one last time. "Let's get to work," he said. The silence in the interrogation room was louder than the jet engines had been, a pressurized void where Brenda's excuses went to die as she realized the brat she had bullied was now the man holding her leash. The air in the Heathrow terminal was thick with the scent of rain and jet fuel, but inside the private transit lounge of the Sterling Legal Group, it smelled of ancient parchment and cold, hard reality. Leo Sterling sat in a high-backed leather chair that made him look even smaller than he was, yet the way the light caught his eyes made him seem like a giant. Beside him, Mr. Henderson, a man whose suit probably cost more than Brenda's annual salary, was meticulously arranging a series of digital tablets on a mahogany table. Outside the glass walls, the airport hummed with the frantic energy of thousands of travelers. But inside this soundproofed sanctuary, the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock. Leo looked out at the runway, watching a skybound Boeing 777, the very one he had just stepped off, being towed to a remote hangar for a mandatory safety and compliance inspection. He knew that inspection was a legal euphemism for a forensic sweep of the crew's behavior, logs, and digital communications. He wasn't just angry. He was disappointed. His grandfather had always told him that the true measure of a person was how they treated someone who could do absolutely nothing for them. Brenda Vance had failed that test in every possible way. At the same time, in a windowless room in the airport security wing, Brenda was vibrating with a mixture of rage and terror. She had been escorted off the plane by two uniformed officers, not through the jet bridge like a respected professional, but down the metal stairs to the tarmac like a common criminal. Her mind was racing, trying to find a loophole, a friend to call, a lie that would stick. She had already tried to tell the police that the boy had been threatening and volatile, but the officer had simply pointed to the tiny, high-definition camera mounted in the first-class galley. "We have the footage, Miss Vance," he had said coolly. "And more importantly, we have the audio." Brenda's stomach had dropped into her shoes. She hadn't realized the new fleet of 777s had integrated cabin monitoring for quality assurance. She had spent 15 years being a predator in a silk scarf, and she had finally walked into a trap of her own making. The door to her room opened, and a man in a corporate sky-bound uniform entered. It wasn't her friend from management. It was the director of human resources, a woman known as the Iron Maiden. Brenda opened her mouth to speak, to spin a tale of a misunderstood interaction, but the director held up a single finger, silencing her instantly. "Don't," the woman said, her voice like grinding stones. "You haven't just committed a disciplinary offense, Brenda. You have triggered a material breach of operational integrity under the Sterling Mandate. Do you have any idea what that means? It means the Sterling Legal Group has the right to freeze our entire London-New York corridor operations until a full audit is completed. You didn't just insult a passenger. You threatened the very existence of this airline's most profitable route." Brenda felt the room spinning. "It was just a juice box," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It was just a child." The director leaned over the table, her eyes flashing. "That child is the only reason you aren't being handed over to the police for child endangerment and harassment right now." He insisted on a civil resolution, which is the only reason we are even talking to you instead of your lawyer. But don't think for a second this is a mercy. He wants a deposition. He wants to see the face of the system that allowed you to flourish. Back at the Sterling office, Leo was looking through Brenda's personnel file. It was a thick dossier filled with redacted complaints and settled disputes. He saw a pattern that made his blood boil. Brenda had a history of targeting solo travelers, the elderly, and anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of elite. She had been protected by a layer of middle management that prioritized cabin discipline over passenger experience. Leo's grandfather had suspected this was happening at Skybound, which was why he had written the extraordinary audit clause into the contract 5 years ago. He had known that a corporation left to its own devices would eventually rot from the inside. Leo was the scalpel that was going to cut out that rot. "Mr. Henderson," Leo said, his voice quiet but firm, "I want to see the list of everyone who signed off on her previous disciplinary reviews. Every manager who dismissed a complaint against her. They're just as responsible as she is." Henderson nodded, his pen scratching across a notepad. "Already underway, Leo. We've identified 4 individuals in the New York hub and 2 here in London. Their access to the company's internal servers has been suspended pending the outcome of your statement." Leo looked at the folder. "And Miss Vance? Is she ready?" Henderson checked his watch. "She's being transported here now. She'll be in the viewing room in 10 minutes. Are you sure you want to do this yourself? We can handle the deposition. You've had a long flight." Leo stood up, smoothing his navy hoodie. "Grandfather said that justice is a personal responsibility. I was the one she threatened. I was the one she tried to starve. I should be the one to hear her explanation." The journey to the interrogation wing of the Sterling building felt like a walk to the gallows for Brenda. Every person she passed, the paralegals, the security guards, the secretaries, seemed to know who she was. The cruel stewardess story was already leaking onto the internal company forums. She was no longer Brenda Vance, the star of the Atlantic route. She was a pariah. When she was finally led into the deposition room, she saw Leo sitting behind the long mahogany table. He looked so small in that massive room, but the power he radiated was suffocating. He wasn't the brat from 2A anymore. He was the law. Brenda took her seat, her hands trembling so much she had to hide them under the table. A court reporter sat in the corner, her fingers poised over a stenography machine. "Miss Vance," Leo began, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Under Section 9 of the Sterling Skybound Master Agreement, this is a formal inquiry into your conduct on Flight 104. You are not under arrest by the state, but your employment, your pension, and your professional certifications are all on the table today. Do you understand the nature of these proceedings?" Brenda nodded, unable to find her voice. "You must speak for the record, Miss Vance," Henderson added sharply. "Yes," Brenda rasped. "I understand." Leo opened a folder and pulled out a photo. It was the dry crackers and the cup of tap water she had served him. "Can you explain the children's menu you described to me? Our records show that Skybound discontinued child-specific meals in first class 3 years ago in favor of a universal gourmet menu." "Where did these crackers come from, Brenda?" She swallowed hard. "They were from Snack Pack in economy. I thought he'd prefer something simple." Leo nodded slowly. And the salmon? The one you told me was only for people who contribute to the economy? We've checked the galley manifest. There were 4 portions of salmon left unserved at the end of the flight. Why did you lie to me? Brenda looked down at the table. I didn't think you belonged there. I thought you were a mistake. Leo leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. In your 15 years with this airline, how many other mistakes have you corrected with hunger and humiliation? How many elderly passengers have you ignored because they didn't look valuable enough? How many solo travelers have you intimidated into silence? Brenda felt a sob rising in her throat, but it wasn't a sob of regret. It was a sob of self-pity. I worked so hard, she wailed suddenly, the mask finally cracking. I spent my life in those aisles. I had to deal with drunk businessmen, screaming babies, and people who treat us like servants. I just wanted one cabin where things were perfect, where people were the way they should be. Leo didn't flinch, and you decided you were the judge of who those people should be. You decided that my hoodie was a crime punishable by dehydration. You decided that your perfect cabin didn't have room for a grieving child. You didn't work for the airline, Brenda. You worked for your own ego. The room went silent again, save for the rapid-fire clicking of the stenograph. Leo turned a page in his folder. We've reviewed your bank records as permitted under the conflict of interest clause of your contract. Brenda's heart stopped. We noticed a series of tips deposited into your account over the last 5 years. Large sums from certain frequent flyers. In exchange for what, Brenda? Extra champagne? Or was it for ensuring that certain undesirables were moved out of their sight? Brenda's silence was her confession. She had been running a private apartheid in the first-class cabin, taking bribes from the wealthy to ensure they didn't have to sit near anyone she deemed unworthy. It was a systemic corruption of the airline's service model, and it was the final nail in her coffin. Henderson spoke up. This goes beyond a simple firing, Brenda. This is a racketeering charge within the corporate structure. You've compromised the legal indemnity of the airline. Every passenger you ever moved, every person you ever mistreated, is now a potential lawsuit against Skybound, and the airline will be looking to you to indemnify them. Brenda felt the world turning gray. Her house, her savings, her reputation, it was all dissolving in the face of this 10-year-old's steady gaze. She looked at Leo, really looked at him, and saw not a child, but the manifestation of every person she had ever wronged. What are you going to do to me? She whispered. Leo closed the folder. I'm not going to do anything to you, Brenda. I'm just going to stop protecting you. The Sterling Legal Group is officially withdrawing its representation of Skybound's labor disputes until every person involved in your perfect cabin system is removed. As for you, we are recommending that the airline pursue full restitution for the damages to their brand. You'll be hearing from our litigation team. Leo stood up, the chair scraping softly against the floor. You asked me on the plane if I wanted to be met by the police in London. I didn't, but I think you might want to call a lawyer. A good one. Though, I should warn you, most of the good ones work for me. As Leo walked out of the room, Henderson trailing behind him, Brenda was left alone with the court reporter. The woman looked up from her machine, her expression one of cold disdain. You know, the reporter said, my mother flew with you once. She said you were the most unpleasant person she'd ever met. I guess she was right. The door clicked shut, leaving Brenda in the silence she had worked so hard to curate, a silence that was now a prison. Outside, the London sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the tarmac. Leo stood by the window of the main lobby, watching the planes take off. He felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had done what his grandfather would have wanted. He hadn't just punished a bully. He had begun to fix a broken system. But as he looked at the list of names Henderson had given him, the names of the managers who had protected Brenda, he knew his work was far from over. This wasn't just about one stewardess. This was about a culture of arrogance that had grown like a weed in the heart of the sky. And Leo Sterling was just getting started with the gardening. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his grandfather's gold pen, the sunlight glinting off its polished surface. He had a lot more notes to take. The next chapter of the Sterling Empire wasn't going to be written in a courtroom. It was going to be written in the very air itself, one flight at a time, until the skies were once again a place where every passenger, no matter what they wore, was treated with the dignity they deserved. He turned to Henderson. "Who's next on the list?" Henderson smiled, a predatory, legalistic grin. "The regional VP of operations, Leo. He's the one who signed off on her Stewardess of the Year award last December." Leo nodded. "Let's go see him then. I'm sure he has a lot to explain." They walked toward the elevator, the young heir and the veteran lawyer, a formidable team ready to dismantle a mountain of corporate arrogance. Brenda Vance was just the first domino, and as the elevator doors closed, the sound echoed through the building like the first thunder of a coming storm. The airline world didn't know it yet, but the weather was changing, and the forecast called for a cold front of accountability, led by a boy in a navy hoodie who knew exactly what his name was worth. Julian Thorne didn't know that the small shadow, standing in his floor-to-ceiling office window, wasn't a ghost, but the executioner of his 30-year career. The skybound corporate headquarters was a jagged shard of glass and obsidian that pierced the gray London skyline, a monument to the very arrogance Leo was currently dissecting. As the elevator ascended to the 50th floor, the executive sanctum, Leo watched the city shrink beneath him, the double-decker buses, looking like the plastic toys he had left behind in his bedroom in Connecticut. Beside the golden parachute Julian Thorne had spent 20 years stitching together was shredded the moment he realized his new boss still had a bedtime him. Mr. Henderson was a silent sentinel, his leather briefcase containing the digital equivalent of a high-yield explosive. The elevator. The glass elevators of Skybound's London headquarters glided upward like bubbles in a champagne flute, offering a panoramic view of the city opened with a chime that sounded like a silver bell, revealing a lobby that felt more like an art gallery than an office. The floor's a skyline, but inside the car, the atmosphere was as cold as a tomb. Leo Sterling stood in the center where polished white marble, so reflective that Leo could see the underside of his own chin. Behind a desk carved from a single piece of driftwood of the small space, his reflection in the polished chrome looking diminutive against the towering presence of Mr. Henderson. The boy said a woman whose hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her eyes into a permanent squint of suspicion. She didn't look's navy hoodie was now zipped to the chin, a shield against the artificial chill of the corporate world he had been thrust into. Up as they approached, "The vice president is in a meeting," she said, her voice a flat, rehearsed drone. Henderson adjusted his silk tie, his eyes fixed on the floor indicator as it climbed toward the 50th floor, is not to be disturbed by solicitors or unannounced visitors. Henderson stepped forward, placing a single card on the marble surface. "It wasn't executive suite." "Julian Thorne is not like Brenda Vance, Leo," Henderson warned quietly, his voice barely audible over the hump of a business card. It was a silver-edged executive access key with the sterling crest embossed in blue of the elevator. "He won't scream, and he won't lose his temper. He's a veteran." The woman's eyes darted to the card, then to the boy in the hoodie, and then back to the card. "Of the boardroom. He'll try to charm you. Then he'll try to patronize you. And if those fail, he'll try to drown you in bureaucratic red tape. He spent his career making problems like this disappear." Leo didn't. Her composure didn't just crack, it shattered. I'll tell him you're here, Mr. Sterling." Immediately, she didn't use the intercom. She stood up and walked toward the double oak doors herself. "Look up." He was staring at a digital tablet, his thumb scrolling through a spreadsheet that mapped out the last 5 years of Skybound's internal disciplinary history. "He didn't make me disappear," Leo said, his voice, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm. Leo didn't wait. He walked past her, his sneakers silent on the marble, and surprisingly steady. He didn't make the recordings from Flight 104 disappear either. He's not pushed open the doors to Julian Thorne's office. Thorne was a man who looked like he had been manufactured in a factory than a magician, Mr. Henderson. He's just a man who forgot that his salary is paid by the people he produced, powerful executives. He was tanned, silver-haired, and dressed in a suit that shimmered with the subtle things he's better than. The elevator doors hissed open, revealing a lobby that looked more like a modern art gallery than a sheen of silk-infused wool. He was standing by his window, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, looking office. A receptionist with hair pulled back in a tight, professional bun looked up, her practiced smile faltering when she saw out over his kingdom. When he turned, his face was a mask of practiced warmth that didn't reach his cold child leading the way. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone hovering on the edge of dismissive. Henderson, calculating eyes. "Ah, the young Mr. Sterling. I was just reading the preliminary report about the unpleasantness on your step forward, placing a heavy, gold-embossed business card on the desk. Leo Sterling is here for his flight. Truly regrettable. A tragic misunderstanding. Brenda Vance has always been a bit overzealous, but her record 10 a.m. with Mr. Thorne. I believe the board has already sent over the notification of his. Leo didn't sit in the chair Thorne offered. He walked to the center of the room, his eyes fixed on the man. Her record is a fabrication, Mr. Thorne, and you're the one who wrote the fiction. Thorne arrival. The receptionist's eyes widened as she looked from the card to Leo. The name Sterling was Moray's smile didn't waver, but his grip on the glass tightened. Now, Leo, more than just a name in this building, it was a sovereign power. She stammered an apology and immediately buzzed the inner sanctum. A moment later, the double mahogany doors swung open, and Julian Thorne emerged. He was a man, and I call you Leo. We're all adults here, or nearly so. Let's not get ahead of ourselves with accusations as late 50s, with silver hair, a tan that suggested frequent trips to the Maldives, and a smile that didn't quite. Brenda is a decorated employee. She has the highest elite service rating in the fleet. If she was a bit short, reach his calculating eyes. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. Leo, with you, perhaps it was the stress of the route. We can offer you a lifetime of first-class travel. A personal boy. Thorne exclaimed, spreading his arms as if to welcome a long-lost nephew. I was so sorry to hear about your apology. And perhaps a scholarship fund in your name? A gesture of goodwill between partners. Leo looked at the glass of Scotch grandfather. Arthur was a titan, a true legend. And to think you're here, carrying on his legacy, so in Thorne's hand. Is that what you offered the family in 2019? The ones who were soon. Come in. Can we get you anything? A soda? Some sweets. Thorne's attempt forced to move to economy because a VIP didn't like the look of their traditional clothing, or the woman in it warmth was so transparent it was almost insulting. Leo walked past him into the office, his eyes scanning the room. 2021 who was denied medical assistance because Miss Vance decided she was faking a panic attack to get attention. I've seen the unredacted files, Julian. My grandfather didn't just leave meth expensive humidor, the framed photos of Thorne with world leaders, the shelf of industry awards. Leo didn't sit in the guest chair. He walked around the massive desk and looked at the executive chair. Though he didn't sit the firm, he left me the back doors to the skybound server. He knew you were sanitizing the logs. He was in it either. He just placed his folder on the desk's leather surface. I'm not here for sweets. Mr. Just waiting for the right moment to prove it. I think being the target of your elite service myself is more Thorne, Leo said, turning to face him. I'm here because you signed off on Brenda Vance's steward than enough proof. Thorne's face went from tanned to a sickly, mottled gray. He set the glass down on Highest of the Year award 4 months ago, despite 3 separate formal complaints filed against her for harassment of minority passengers in desk with a heavy thud. You're playing a dangerous game, kid. This isn't a schoolyard solo minors in the preceding year. I'm here because you personally authorized the Cabin Priority Protocol, a document that isn't in the Public Employee Handbook but appears in the private executive server. Thorne smiled and vanished. This is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. You pull one thread, and the whole thing unravels. Thousands of jobs, the stock price, the legal stability of the entire airline. All because a stewardess didn't give you apple juice? But it stiffened the muscles in his jaw tightening. He walked to the window, looking out over the Thames. Leo, you're young, and you've had a very traumatic few weeks. The aviation industry is complex. It's about the consequences. Henderson spoke up then, his voice a cool contrast to Thorne's growing desperation. We have thought about them, Julian. That's why we've already filed the injunctions. As of 10 minutes ago, this about balance. We have to keep our high-yield passengers happy. If that means our crew has to be firm to maintain the environment they pay for, then that's a management decision. Brenda Vance was one of our most effective enforcers of that environment. She kept the first-class cabin exactly how our most important clients wanted it. Exclusive. Sterling Legal Group has invoked the moral turpitude clause of the master contract. We aren't just pulling a Leo, opened his folder, and pulled out a printout of the gray list. It was a document he had found in thread. We're burning the tapestry. Thorne lunged for his phone, but the screen was already dead, replaced by the sterling crest. He looked at Leo, the mask of the executive finally falling away to reveal the frightened, greedy man the airline's encrypted legal archives, a list of passengers who were to be minimized or discouraged from rebooking in premium cabins based on their social media influence, their perceived net worth, or their aesthetic fit for beneath. You can't do this. I have a board of directors. I have a contract. Leo stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that filled the room. The board of directors is currently receiving a synchronized briefing on the elite the brand. Thorne's name was at the bottom of every page, his initials scrawled in blue ink. You Caller charge, you've been skimming into an offshore account in the Caymans. The money you took from passengers to ensure they were protected from people like me. Brenda Vance wasn't just a stewardess. She was your collector. She harassed this balance. Leo asked, his voice rising slightly but remaining controlled. I call it a violation of the International Civil Aviation Organization's NON. The people you didn't want in your cabin, and you made sure the complaints vanished. You didn't just discrimination statutes. My grandfather didn't just handle your contracts, Mr. Thorne. He wrote the ethical guidelines for this entire industry. He believed that the sky was the one place where everyone was equal because everyone was at the mercy of the fail at your job. Julian, you turned this airline into a country club for bigots. Thorne fell back in his chair, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at the boy, this small, unassuming child, and realized he wasn't same laws of physics. You turned his airline into a gated community. Thorne turned away from the window, his mask finally looking at a victim. He was looking at the personification of every law he had broken, every person he had stepped slipping. The charming uncle was gone, replaced by a cold, corporate predator. Listen to me, you little up on to climb his glass mountain. What do you want? Thorne asked, his voice a broken rasp. Leo didn't start. You might have inherited a law firm, but you don't know the first thing about running a billion-dollar company to answer immediately. He walked to the window, looking out at the plains in the distance. I want what? You think your grandfather was a saint? He was a businessman. He understood that some people matter more than others. If you my grandfather wanted, I want the truth to be the standard, not a luxury. I want every person who has ever tried to use this gray list against me. You'll be tied up in litigation for the next 20 years. I bullied by Brenda Vance or ignored by you to receive a letter of apology and full restitution. And I want you to have a team of lawyers who eat children like you for breakfast. You should have stayed on the plane and enjoyed your crackers out of this building right now with nothing but what's in your pockets. No severance, no pension, no executive consultant title. You're done, Julian. The stewardess of the year was the first domino. Henderson stepped forward, his face a mask of legal steel. Julian, I wouldn't finish that sentence if you're the second. The door opened, and two men in dark suits, internal security, but not Thorne. I were you. You seem to forget that the Sterling Legal Group doesn't just represent Skybound. We hold the voting's men. Entered the room. They didn't look at Thorne. They looked at Leo. The board has reached a decision, Mr. Sterling, one of them said. Mr. Thorne's access has been revoked. Proxies for the minority shareholders who represent 49% of the company's stock. And those shareholders are very sensitive to things like civil rights violations and brand-damaging scandals. Leo isn't just here as a child. We are here to escort him from the premises. Thorne stood up, his movements robotic, his eyes hollow. He looked at his desk. He's here as the executor of the Sterling Trust. Leo didn't wait for Thorne to respond. He reached into his hoodie and pulled out a small, encrypted USB drive. This contains the last 4 hours of Flight 104's at the photos of his yachts and his gala dinners. And then at Leo. "You're a monster," Thorne whispered. Leo turned to face him, his expression calm and resolute. "No, Mr. Thorne. I'm cabin audio, Mr. Thorne." It also contains the recorded deposition of Brenda Vance, who was more than happy to explain that she was a Sterling. And you should have checked the manifest before you decided who didn't belong in first class. As Thorne was led away following verbal directives from your office to ensure that certain passengers were made to feel unwelcome so they wouldn't book, his protests echoing down the marble hallway, the office felt suddenly very large and very quiet. Henderson approached Leo, his hand first class again. She even mentioned the bonuses she received for keeping the social profile of the cabin high. Those bonuses were paid from a discretionary fund that you personally oversee. Thorne's face went from tan to a sickly, mottled, resting briefly on the boy's shoulder. "That was precisely handled, Leo. Your grandfather would have been proud." Gray. He looked at the USB drive as if it were a live grenade. That's an internal matter. It's not proof of anything." Leo shook his head. "It's proof of a conspiracy to violate the terms of service, but you know this is just the beginning. The board will try to bargain. They'll try to pin it all on Thorne and Vance." Leo nodded, his eyes reflecting the cold light of the London sky. "I know. That's why I wanted that every passenger signs when they buy a ticket. It's proof that you use company funds to enforce a private prejudice. And as of 5 minutes ago, it's also in the hands of the Civil Aviation Authority and the 3 major newspapers' full audit of the crew training department next. And I want to see the logs for every flight Brenda Vance worked in the last 5 years. There are people out there who were hurt, Henderson. People who felt small and ashamed because of her. We're going to find them. In London and New York." The silence that followed was absolute. Thorne looked like a man who had just seen the ground disappear beneath his feet. He lunged for the desk, perhaps to grab the drive, perhaps to grab Leo, but Henderson was faster every single one. He sat down in Thorne's massive chair, the leather creaking under his slight weight. He looked at stepping between them with the quiet authority of a man who had seen all. The board of directors is meeting in stacks of folders and the glowing computer screens, the digital pulse of an empire. He felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and purpose. He had spent his whole life watching his grandfather navigate these waters, thinking it was a game of words and papers. Now 1 hour, Julian Henderson said. "They've seen the preliminary report. They aren't going to fight for you. They're going to use you as a human shield too. Protect the airline's stock price." He knew it was a battle for the soul of how people treated one another. He picked up Thorne's gold not just being fired. You're being purged. Leo picked up his folder, looking at Thorne with a mixture of pity and resolve-plated desk pen, and held it for a moment, then dropped it into the wastebasket. He pulled his own fountain pen from his pocket, the one his grandfather had given him. "Call the New York office," Leo said, his voice steady and commanding. "I want a meeting. My grandfather once told me that arrogance is a slow-acting poison. You think you're the one in control because you have the office and the title, but you lost control the moment you stopped seeing people as people. Brenda Vance was just the symptom, Mr. Thorne. You were the disease. And I'm here to make sure this airline gets healthy with the lead purser of every long-haul route. And tell the CEO that if he wants to keep his contract again." Thorne slumped into his chair, the silver hair suddenly looking dull, the tan looking like a mask of ash. He was a man who had spent his life building a fortress of influence, only to have it dismantled by a boy in a hoodie who with the Sterling Group. "He'll be at my hotel by 8 o'clock tonight. We have a lot of changes to make." Henderson smiled, a genuine look of respect in his eyes. "Right away, Mr. Sterling." Leo refused to play by his rules. "What now?" Thorne whispered, his voice broken. Leo walked to the door, stayed in the office for a long time after Henderson left, watching the sun dip lower in the sky, turning the glass with his hand on the handle. "Now, we go through the rest of the list. We find every manager who knew buildings of London into pillars of fire." He thought about Brenda Vance, sitting in her cell or her living room, wondering where it had all gone wrong. He thought about the juice box she had kicked. It was such a small thing about the gray list. We fined every crew member who followed Brenda's lead. And then we changed the rules. From now on, the only priority in this airline will be decency. As Leo and Henderson walked back through the gallery, a tiny act of cruelty that had triggered an avalanche. He realized then that power wasn't just about money or law. It was about the accumulation of small acts. Brenda had built her power on small acts of hate, and he would build his on small acts of like lobby. The staff watched them in hushed awe. The news was already spreading through the corporate grapevine. Julian Thorne was out, and the Sterling boy was taking no prisoners. They reached the elevator, and as the doors closed, he stood up, adjusted his hoodie, and walked out of the office, his shadow stretching long and thin across the white marble floor. He wasn't just a child traveling alone anymore. He was the architect of a new kind of sky, and Leo, let out a long, shaky breath. The adrenaline was fading, leaving him feeling the weight of his age. Once didn't need a first-class ticket to prove he belonged there. As he reached the elevator, he saw the receptionist again. She looked at him with a new kind of expression, not fear, but a cautious, burgeoning hope. "More. You did well, Leo," Henderson said, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder. "Your grandfather would have been proud." But Thorne was right about one thing. There are more of them. This goes deep into the regional offices. We have work to do in New York. Leo looked at his tablet, the list of names glowing in the dim mister. "Sterling?" she called out softly. Leo stopped and turned. "Yes." She hesitated, then smiled. "My cousin. She was a junior attendant under Miss Vance. She was fired because she gave an extra blanket to a passenger who light of the elevator." "I know, but we have a long flight back to New York. I think I'll use that time to draft the new service charter." Henderson smiled. "And what will be the first rule?" Leo looked at the chrome doors, seeing his reflection, not as a small child, but as a leader in the making. Rule number 1. Everyone gets with shivering. Miss Vance said it was wasteful. Do you think she can have her job back?" Leo felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the office heating. He walked back to the desk, took the salmon. The elevator reached the ground floor, and as the doors opened to the bustle of the London streets, Leo Sterling stepped out into the world, no longer just an heir, but a force to be reckoned with. He knew the battle notepad and wrote down his direct office number. "Tell her to call this number tomorrow morning. We're looking for people for the soul of Skybound Airways" was just beginning, but he also knew he had the momentum. He had dismantled the queen who know how to take care of others. "I think she'll fit right in." The woman's eyes filled with tears as in the night. Now, it was time to go for the king. The corporate world had underestimated him because of his age and his clothes. She took the paper. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Leo nodded and stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed, but they were beginning to realize that the most dangerous opponent is the one who has nothing to lose and everything to prove. As they hailed a car for the airport, Leo looked up at the sky, watching a silver jet climb through the clouds. He felt the weight of the Sterling name, not as a burden, but as a bridge. He had dismantled the tyrant today, but he had also started to build something better. The world was full of Brenda Van Cess and Julian Thorns, but he wasn't afraid of flying anymore. He was the one steering the wind. The next stop was New York, the heart of the airline's operations, and Leo was ready to bring the storm with him. He had the evidence. He was also full of people who just wanted to give someone a blanket. And as long as he held the keys to the legal empire, he was going to make sure the blanket givers were the ones who ruled the skies. The descent was fast, had the law, and most importantly, he had the moral clarity that the men in the high offices had traded away years ago. The pressure in his ears a reminder of the altitude he had just conquered. When he stepped out into the lobby, the rain had started to fall, a soft London drizzle that washed the dust from the streets. He didn't wait for a car. He walked out into the rain, the cool water hitting his face, feeling more alive than he ever had. He was Leo. Descent of Julian Thorne was just the prologue. The real story was about to begin in the halls of the New York hub, where the architecture of arrogance was most deeply rooted. Leo tucked the USB drive into his pocket, his fingers brushing against his grandfather's sterling, and the story was only just beginning. Silas Vane didn't know that the small boy in the oversized hoodie wasn't just bringing a lawsuit. He was bringing the end of an era where people were treated like cargo and profits were weighed in blood and silence. The return flight from London to New York was a different world entirely. Leo sat in seat 1A of the skybound 777, but the atmosphere was transformed. The crew moved with a quiet, respectful urgency, not because they were afraid of him, but because the word had trickled down from the London hub. The boy in 2A was the one who had finally stood up to Brenda Vance. The junior attendants, many of whom had spent years under Brenda's thumb, looked at Leo with a mixture of awe and profound relief. He wasn't the brat anymore. He was the catalyst. Mr. Henderson sat across the aisle, his laptop glowing with a relentless stream of incoming data. Silas Vane is digging in, Leo, Henderson said, his voice tight with the strain of the unfolding legal battle. He's called an emergency session of the board of directors for tonight at the JFK Corporate Annex. He's going to try to argue that your grandfather's contract is antiquated and that a minor cannot exercise the termination for cause clause. He's trying to characterize this as a hostile takeover by a child. Leo looked out at the vast, indigo expanse of the Atlantic. Let him try, Leo whispered. He thinks this is about money. He thinks it's a game of numbers. He doesn't realize it's about the juice box. Leo spent the flight not in sleep, but in deep study of the Shadow Protocol, a hidden ledger his grandfather had encrypted within the firm's digital vaults. It wasn't just about service complaints. It was a record of systemic safety shortcuts Silas Vane had authorized to pad his executive bonuses. Vane had been cutting maintenance hours on the older fleet to pay for the elite service branding that Julian Thorne and Brenda Vance had weaponized. The arrogance wasn't just in the cabin. It was in the engines. When the plane touched down at JFK, the landing felt heavier, more consequential. The rainy tarmac mirrored the gray, steely resolve in Leo's heart. They were met not by a limo, but by a fleet of black SUVs manned by the Sterling Legal Group's private security. Silas Vane's welcoming committee, a group of PR fixers and mid-level lawyers, was brushed aside like dust as Leo marched toward the annex. The building was a brutalist structure of concrete and glass, standing on the edge of the airfield like a watchful predator. Inside, the boardroom was a theater of corporate power. Silas Vane sat at the head of the table, a man who looked like he was carved from granite, his eyes cold and unyielding. He didn't rise when Leo entered. He didn't even look at him. This meeting is for voting members and legal representatives only, Vane said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that filled the room. The boy can wait in the lobby with a coloring book. Leo didn't flinch. He walked to the foot of the table, his sneakers squeaking on the polished floor, and placed a heavy, black flight data recorder, the black box of a company's soul, on the mahogany surface. I'm not here to color, Mr. Vane, Leo said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. I'm here to exercise Section 1, Paragraph 1 of the Sterling Mandate, the right of total disclosure. Vane's eyes flickered toward the recorder. That's a theatrical gesture, nothing more. You have no standing here. Henderson stepped forward, his voice like a whip. Actually, Silas, under the 1998 restructuring agreement that Arthur Sterling personally drafted, the heir to the Sterling firm holds the golden proxy in the event of a documented safety and ethics breach. We have the data from Flight 104. We have the records from the London hub. And more importantly, we have the maintenance log for the 737 MAX fleet you try to hide in the Nevada desert. The color drained from the board members' faces. They looked at each other, the realization dawning that the child they were supposed to dismiss was actually the one holding the fuse to their entire careers. Leo tapped the recorder. Brenda Vance didn't just refuse me service. She revealed a culture where people don't matter. And when people don't matter, maintenance doesn't matter. Training doesn't matter. Safety doesn't matter. You've been flying on luck, Silas, and your luck just ran out. For the next 3 hours, the boardroom became a courtroom. Leo didn't let up. He presented the evidence of the gray list, The thousands of passengers who had been blacklisted or harassed because they didn't fit the elite image. He showed the emails where Vane had mocked a disabled veteran who had complained about the lack of accessibility on a long-haul flight. He showed the financial trail of the bonuses paid to Thorne and Vance for keeping the cabin pure. Silas Vane tried to fight, his voice rising in a desperate roar. I built this airline. I made it profitable. You're just a kid who doesn't understand how the world works. You need people like Brenda Vance to keep the riffraff in line. Leo stood up, leaning his small hands on the table. The riffraff are the people who pay your salary, Silas. They are mothers, students, soldiers, and children. They are human beings. My grandfather knew that. He told me that the law is a shield for the weak, not a sword for the strong. You used it as a sword, and now it's going to break in your hand. The final blow came when Leo revealed the Sarah clause. He had Sarah, the junior flight attendant Brenda had bullied, waiting on a video link. She spoke for 20 minutes about the culture of fear, the way Brenda would force them to hide blankets and water from passengers who weren't valuable. She spoke about the time Brenda had left a diabetic man without sugar for 4 hours because he was rude about his seat being broken. The board members, many of whom had families and consciences that had long been buried under stock options, began to turn. One by one, they looked away from Vane and toward Leo. I move for a vote of no confidence in the CEO, the oldest board member said, her voice trembling. And I move for the immediate appointment of an interim legal overseer from the Sterling Group. The vote was unanimous. Silas Vane was stripped of his power in the very room where he had once felt like a god. He was escorted out by the same security team that had once saluted him, his face a mask of bitter, impotent rage. As the doors closed behind him, the room felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from the building itself. Leo didn't celebrate. He felt a profound sense of exhaustion. He walked to the window and watched a skybound plane take off into the night sky. What happens now, Mr. Henderson? Leo asked. Now, we fix it, Henderson replied. We reinstate the fired crew members. We issue the apologies. We dissolve the gray list. And we start the audit of the maintenance hangars. It's going to be a long year, Leo. Leo nodded. I want to start with Brenda Vance. I want her to see what she cost. Not out of spite, but because she needs to understand that she was part of something much bigger and much uglier than she realized. A week later, Leo sat in a small conference room at the New York Port Authority. Brenda Vance sat across from him. Looking older, her face devoid of the makeup and the arrogance that had defined her. She was facing multiple civil suits and a permanent ban from the aviation industry. Why did you do it? Leo asked quietly. Why the crackers? Why the water? Why the threats? Brenda looked at her hands. I thought I was being special, she whispered. I thought I was part of the inner circle. They told us that the passengers in first class were the only ones who mattered, and that anyone else was just noise. I forgot that I was the noise once, too. Leo pushed a piece of paper across the table. It was a settlement offer, but not for money. It was a requirement for her to perform 1,000 hours of community service at a children's hospital, working in the cafeteria. You forgot how to serve, Brenda, Leo said. Maybe this will help you remember. Brenda looked at the paper and then at the boy she had once tried to erase. She picked up a pen and signed it, her hand shaking. Thank you, she said, her voice barely audible. For what? Leo asked. For stopping me, she said. I didn't like who I was becoming. I just didn't know how to stop. Leo walked out of the room and into the main terminal of JFK. He stood in the middle of the bustling crowd, the heart of the world's travel. He saw families hugging, business travelers rushing, and a lone child sitting on a suitcase, looking lost. Leo walked over to the child, a young girl about 7 years old. Are you okay? He asked. The girl looked up, her eyes wide. I'm waiting for my dad. He's coming from the gate, but I don't know where it is. Leo smiled, a genuine, warm smile that made him look like a 10-year-old again. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, gold-wrapped chocolate he had taken from the boardroom. Here, it's okay. I know exactly where the gate is. I'll wait with you. As he sat with the girl in the suitcase, Leo felt his grandfather's presence more strongly than ever. He wasn't just the heir to a law firm. He was the guardian of the sky. He had taken down the stewardess, the VP, and the CEO, but his greatest victory was right here, in the simple act of being kind to someone who could do nothing for him. The Sterling Legal Group would continue to grow. The airline would be rebranded as Sterling Skies, and the rules of the air would be rewritten in the language of empathy. Leo looked up at the departures board. The Sterling Skies flight to London was on time. The service was listed as universal. The cabin was open to everyone. And as the sun began to rise over the Atlantic, casting a golden glow over the terminal, Leo knew that the journey was finally over. He had inherited an empire, but he had found his soul. The legacy of Arthur Sterling wasn't in the contracts or the buildings. It was in the boy who sat on a suitcase, making sure a stranger didn't feel alone. The sky was no longer a place of gated communities and hidden cruelties. It was a vast, open blue, where every passenger had a name, every name had a story, and every story deserved to be heard. Leo took a deep breath of the terminal air, the scent of jet fuel and hope, and realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the future. He was the one writing it, one flight at a time. The world was changing, and from 30,000 feet, it looked more beautiful than he had ever imagined. He reached into his hoodie and pulled out his phone, sending a one-word text to Mr. Henderson. Ready. The work was just beginning, but the storm had passed, and the sky was finally clear. Thank you for following the story of Leo Sterling. Do you think Leo's method of justice for Brenda Vance, community service in a cafeteria, was more effective than a simple jail sentence or A? Fine? Why or why not? If you were in Leo's shoes, would you have been able to stay as calm and calculated as he was throughout the flight? Or would you have reacted differently in the moment? Which character do you think was the true villain of the story? The stewardess who performed the cruelty, the VP who enabled it, or the CEO who turned it into a corporate strategy? What do you think is the most important lesson this story teaches about power and how we treat people who seem lesser than us?